The wind howled through the jagged cliffs, carrying the bitter scent of pine and snow. She stumbled along the rocky trail, her hands pressed against her swollen belly, each step heavier than the last. Night was falling, and the shadows of the wilderness seemed to close in around her, reminding her that she was utterly alone. Abandoned by the man she had once trusted, every breath became a struggle, every heartbeat a reminder of the life she carried and the life she feared would be lost. Then through the thickening mist he appeared, a figure both aged and strong, his eyes steady and knowing, his presence calm like the mountains themselves. Could this stranger truly be her salvation, or was he another enigma of the wild, meant to test her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The widow's hands trembled as she brushed loose soil from the small, metal object half buried beneath a rock. Its surface was scratched, worn, yet the needle remained steadfast, quivering only slightly before settling toward a single direction. She held it up, watching the fading sunlight glint against its glass face, feeling a strange calm wash over her. The wilderness around her remained unforgiving, the wind slicing across jagged cliffs, the scent of damp pine and decaying leaves clinging to the air. But for a fleeting moment, the compass seemed like a whisper of order in the chaos. The Apache knelt beside her, his eyes soft yet watchful. He did not speak at first, merely observing how carefully she cradled the object. Finally he said, "It has guided others before. Perhaps now it will guide you." His voice was quiet, not commanding but full of assurance, the kind of confidence that had seen him through decades of survival in this harsh land. She turned it over in her hands, the weight of its history pressing lightly against her palm. Perhaps it had belonged to a pioneer or a wanderer who, like her, had once felt abandoned, alone, and uncertain. Perhaps it had led them safely through valleys and rivers, across mountains, past dangers now forgotten by time. She thought of the life growing inside her and realized that every step she would take now needed guidance, not only for her own survival, but for the child she carried. For the first time in days, she let herself consider a path beyond mere existence. The cabin no longer seemed like a prison or a refuge, only by necessity. It could become the starting point of a journey. The Apache's steady presence beside her reinforced that thought. He had led her here, had shielded her from the cold, the hunger, the unrelenting wilderness. Yet even with him the future was uncertain, and she knew she must decide how to move forward. That evening, after the sun dipped below the distant peaks and the first stars pricked the deepening sky, she laid the compass on the table carved from rough timber. Its needle quivered once, then steadied, pointing north. The Apache watched her, his expression unreadable but patient. She felt the pull of the wilderness around them, the dark woods, the hidden valleys, the relentless wind, but also the quiet, unspoken promise that perhaps with guidance she could find a way through it all. Night descended, and the wind whispered outside, rattling the cabin's wooden walls. She traced the needle with her finger, imagining routes across snow-laden cliffs and winding rivers, planning a cautious path toward safety, toward home, toward life. Somewhere beyond the trees, beyond the mountains, there was a horizon not yet reached, a place where survival could evolve into something more, a life rebuilt with careful steps, wisdom, and trust. The Apache broke the silence finally, his voice low and even. "The compass points the way, but the courage to follow it is yours alone." She nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle alongside the weight of the compass in her hands. Perhaps guidance existed not just in objects, but in the combination of choice, trust, and quiet determination. As she finally curled up near the cabin's hearth, the metal compass glinting faintly in the firelight, she allowed herself a deep, steady breath. For the first time, she imagined not just surviving, but navigating a path forward, one deliberate, measured step at a time. She did not yet know where the compass would truly lead, or what dangers might lie in wait, but she understood that she would face them armed with more than instinct. She would have guidance, presence, and a flicker of hope, Fragile but unwavering, the night pressed on, cold and vast, but inside the cabin, a quiet resolve took root, guided by the steady needle and the quiet strength of the man who had become her anchor. Morning light seeped through the cracks in the cabin walls, soft gold streaks across rough timber floors. The widow rose slowly, her body aching from the cold night, and shuffled toward the hearth. There, the Apache was already tending a small fire, adding kindling with quiet precision. His movements were methodical, calm, every action deliberate, as if the world outside could only touch him if he allowed it. She noticed the old iron kettle sitting beside the hearth, blackened from years of use. Its handle was chipped, the spout slightly bent, but it still seemed capable of holding water, of producing warmth. She reached for it hesitantly, feeling the cool metal beneath her fingers. "We'll need this," he said softly, anticipating her thoughts. "Water first, then food. Every journey starts with what sustains us." His voice carried no condescension, only quiet assurance, the kind that allowed trust to grow slowly, without pressure. She filled the kettle at the small spring nearby, the water icy against her palms. Steam rose as she set it on the fire, curling lazily toward the ceiling. For a moment, the wilderness seemed to pause. The wind softened outside, and the distant trees stood still, as if honoring the fragile moment of domesticity. The kettle became more than metal. It was a vessel of survival, a symbol of their tenuous claim on life within the vast, indifferent wild. As the water heated, he showed her how to prepare dried herbs and roots, teaching her which plants were safe, which could soothe hunger or ease pain. She listened carefully, her eyes tracing his hands, the rhythm of his movements. Every instruction was a lesson in patience and observation. When she poured hot water into a simple bowl, she felt a sense of accomplishment that had been absent for days. The small, steady act of preparing food, of warming herself and her child, grounded her in a reality that was no longer defined solely by fear. The Apache watched silently, nodding when she stirred the liquid carefully. "Sustenance is more than hunger," he remarked. "It is patience, it is respect for what endures." She absorbed the words slowly, feeling their truth. Survival was not merely about strength. It was about the measured attention to small acts, the quiet recognition of what kept life moving forward. As the hours passed, they worked together to make the cabin more habitable. She swept the floor, moved rocks to shore up corners, and stacked firewood neatly beside the hearth. Every movement seemed heavier than before, yet purposeful. He offered guidance when needed, never rushing, never judging, allowing her to regain confidence in herself. The iron kettle simmered, a gentle reminder that life could continue, that care and patience were allies, even in a wilderness that demanded vigilance. By midday, a simple meal was ready, soft roots boiled with herbs, nourished not just the body but the spirit. She tasted it cautiously, surprised at the warmth it brought. Across the small room, he watched her with a steady gaze, not intrusive, only observant, a quiet anchor amid the uncertainty. The act of sharing food, of preparing and consuming together, began to weave the threads of companionship and reliance. In the afternoon, she sat near the hearth, cradling the warm bowl in her hands, and felt a strange, unfamiliar peace. The wilderness outside remained vast and indifferent, yet inside, small rituals, boiling water, simmering herbs, sharing food, were shaping a microcosm of stability. The kettle, dented and worn, symbolized a rhythm to life: heat, sustenance, care, patience. She began to imagine longer days, slowly building a sense of security that did not rely solely on the Apache. Though his presence was an unspoken comfort as the sun dipped toward the horizon, spilling gold and amber through the cabin's small windows. She set the kettle beside the fire, watching steam rise. It was a simple object, yet in its quiet presence lay hope, a tangible reminder that survival was not just about endurance, but about creating life within a place that could have swallowed her whole. She felt the weight of the day settle into her bones. not as fatigue alone, but as the beginning of a pattern, a structure she could rely on, a small foundation from which courage and trust could grow. The Apache added a few more logs to the fire, glancing at her with a quiet understanding. They did not speak much. Words were unnecessary when presence itself carried meaning. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, but inside, the iron kettle simmered gently, a heartbeat in the cabin, a symbol of life reclaimed, of small victories stitched together through patience, care, and quiet determination. As darkness fell, the widow felt a flicker of certainty. She could endure, she could survive, and perhaps slowly, she could learn to live again. Morning arrived soft and grey, the sky veiled in mist that clung to the mountains like a fragile shroud. She stirred awake to the scent of burning wood, the cabin warm despite the chill that lingered in the corners. The Apache had already begun gathering what little supplies remained, moving with a calm precision that made the cabin feel alive with purpose. Her eyes fell on a leather satchel tucked in the corner, its surface cracked and softened by years of handling. Curious, she approached it cautiously, lifting the flap to reveal a trove of small but invaluable items. Dried herbs, assorted seeds, a flint for fire, and a few primitive tools. He noticed her inspection but said nothing, merely nodded. "These belonged to those who came before," he said finally. "They planned for tomorrow, even if they did not see it." His words carried a quiet weight, teaching her that survival demanded foresight, care, and respect for what endured. She ran her fingers over the seeds, feeling their smooth, resilient surfaces. Each was a promise of future growth, a quiet defiance against the wild's indifference. The herbs spoke of healing, of knowledge preserved across generations. The tools, though simple, were extensions of human ingenuity, proof that even the smallest efforts could shape survival. In that moment, the cabin seemed less like a shelter imposed upon her by circumstance and more like a repository of lessons, a connection to those who had lived, struggled, and prepared for life before her. The Apache guided her hands gently, showing how to plant seeds in a small patch outside the cabin, careful not to disturb the fragile soil. "Patience and attention," he said, "will turn this earth into sustenance. Small efforts, repeated, create life." She worked beside him, digging shallow furrows, pressing seeds into the soil, feeling the weight of possibility in each motion. The act was humbling, grounding her in the present while giving her a vision for the future. As the day progressed, he demonstrated how to identify herbs useful for both food and medicine, explaining their properties and applications. She listened attentively, absorbing not only facts but also a philosophy. Respect, observation, and preparation were as vital as physical strength. The leather satchel had become a teacher, its contents a bridge between survival and understanding, between mere existence and the cultivation of life. At midday, she found herself seated on a weathered log, holding the satchel on her lap. She examined each item again, imagining the stories it might carry. Who had packed these seeds? Who had carried the herbs and tools through winters harsher than she could imagine? The thought unsettled her, yet it also instilled a sense of continuity, a lineage of endurance reaching across time to her own fragile presence in the wilderness. The Apache spoke from the fire, his voice steady, calm, a counterpoint to the restless wind outside. "Life is a sequence of preparation and patience. We take what is given, we use it carefully, and we pass it forward." She nodded, feeling the resonance of his words in her chest. They were not simply lessons for survival. They were principles for living, for enduring the wilderness of both land and heart. By evening, they had planted a modest patch of herbs and seeds, each carefully spaced, each motion deliberate. The widow felt a quiet pride, a rare sensation in recent days dominated by fear and exhaustion. The leather satchel, now empty of its contents but full of purpose, lay beside the fire. In it, she saw more than tools. She saw connection, foresight, and the slow, patient unfolding of life. Dinner was simple. Roots and herbs boiled over the fire, nourished by the care they had taken throughout the day. The Apache watched her quietly, sharing no words, only presence allowing the ritual to speak for itself. She felt the rhythm of life returning, a cadence defined by small victories, measured effort, and the quiet assurance that she was not alone. When night fell, she placed the leather satchel near her bedroll, a constant reminder of what had been given and what could yet be cultivated. Outside, the wilderness remained indifferent, shadows deep and shifting, but inside the cabin, the objects of preparation, seeds, herbs, tools, spoke of patience, hope, and a life rebuilt from careful intention. For the first time in days, she felt a faint sense of possibility. The child growing within her, the wilderness surrounding her, and the man who had become her guide, all merged into a fragile but compelling promise that life, when nurtured with care and wisdom, could flourish even in the harshest of places. The morning air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and pine needles. She stepped outside, barefoot on the cold, uneven ground, and spotted a slender, hand-carved walking stick leaning against a boulder near the cabin. Its surface was smooth from years of use, yet the etched symbols hinted at careful craftsmanship, a silent record of survival and intention. She lifted it cautiously, feeling its reassuring weight in her hands. The Apache, observing from the doorway, nodded without comment. "It will guide you," he said simply. His voice, calm and measured, carried a depth of experience she could only glimpse. Like wind brushing over mountains worn smooth by time, she followed his instructions as he demonstrated how to navigate rough terrain using the stick. Its tip struck roots, rocks, and hidden depressions, revealing hazards otherwise invisible. With each careful step, she felt a surge of confidence, a tiny flame against the vast uncertainty of the wilderness. The stick became an extension of herself, a bridge between fear and capability. She realized that the journey ahead would demand more than courage. It required tools, a knowledge and trust in what had come before. As they moved through the forest, he spoke of the land in quiet reflections, describing the rhythms of seasons, the habits of wildlife, and the subtle signs of weather shifts. She listened attentively, absorbing not only the practical guidance, but also the underlying philosophy. The wilderness was impartial, indifferent to weakness, yet generous to those who observed, respected and adapted. She tested her balance on slippery, moss-covered rocks, the stick steady in her grip. Each motion taught patience, each misstep underscored the need for careful attention. By midday, they reached a small clearing where wildflowers struggled through rocky soil, their resilience evident against the harsh conditions. The Apache instructed her on foraging techniques, showing which plants could nourish and which could harm. He pointed to a cluster of bright leaves and explained their medicinal properties. She knelt beside him, hands brushing the rough earth, feeling a connection not just to survival, but to knowledge accumulated over generations. The walking stick rested against her shoulder, a quiet reminder of guidance and endurance. The weight of the wood, grounding her in the moment. She spoke of her late husband, voice trembling as the memories surfaced. She admitted fears about raising a child alone in such unforgiving terrain, and for the first time she allowed herself to voice the quiet desperation she had carried for weeks. He listened without interruption, eyes steady, presence unwavering. When she finished, he placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, the gesture firm yet gentle. "Strength is built in silence as much as in action," he said. "Even when the path seems uncertain, the steps you take now will shape the journey ahead." The afternoon brought a sudden challenge, a steep incline, slick with early morning dew. She hesitated at the base, fear rising like a tide. He offered no hand, but gestured toward the stick. "It is not a crutch," he said. "It is an extension of your resolve. Trust yourself." With deliberate care, she advanced, testing each foothold, letting the stick bear the brunt of hidden hazards. Her pulse raced, yet with each successful step, confidence built, layering over fear. When she finally reached the summit, the forest stretched endlessly before her, the sun glinting through a patchwork of mist and shadow. She breathed deeply, the weight of the stick in her hands no longer a reminder of difficulty but of resilience earned. Evening settled with soft, fading light. They returned to the cabin, both silent, the lessons of the day settling into their bones. The walking stick was cleaned and placed near the hearth, its presence quiet but commanding. It had guided her across perilous terrain, provided assurance, and most importantly, taught her that reliance on skill and preparation was as vital as courage and hope. By nightfall, she sat by the fire, cradling her belly, feeling the gentle flutter of life within. The wilderness, vast and indifferent, pressed outside the cabin walls, yet inside, tools, knowledge, and presence coalesced into a fragile sanctuary. The hand-carved walking stick rested nearby, a symbol of the guidance she had received and the resilience she was learning to embody. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to imagine not merely surviving, but navigating a future shaped by her own steady steps. She understood then that the wilderness demanded patience, respect, and careful attention. But it also offered lessons in endurance, wisdom, and quiet strength. With the walking stick, she could face each day intentionally, guided by experience, trust, and the steady pulse of life unfolding around her. Morning light filtered through the cabin's small windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing lazily in the air. The widow rose slowly, the weight of the child she carried pressing against her movements, yet she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her eyes fell upon a woven basket tucked beneath a rafter, its fibers frayed but intact. She lifted it carefully, feeling the texture of the hand-woven strands beneath her fingers, a testament to patience and care. It seemed almost to pulse with the energy of the hands that had crafted it, a quiet reminder that even in the wilderness, tools shaped by human ingenuity could sustain life. The Apache observed her with a calm, measured gaze. "That basket has carried many things before," he said, voice low and deliberate. "It will carry what we gather today, and perhaps tomorrow it will teach patience once more." He gestured toward the forest, where roots, herbs, and berries awaited discovery. Together, they set out into the early morning mist. She carried the basket while he pointed out edible plants, medicinal herbs, and hidden roots. Every instruction was layered with wisdom. Every step forward demanded attention. She learned to bend carefully, to examine leaves, to recognize subtle color variations that marked danger or nourishment. The basket became an extension of her hands, a tool to organize and protect what she gathered. Each berry, each root placed inside was a small victory, a claim against the wilderness that sought to overwhelm her. As they worked, the Apache spoke quietly of balance, the balance between taking what is needed and leaving what is essential for renewal. "The forest provides," he said, "but only when we respect it." She nodded, feeling a sense of responsibility not only for herself and the child she carried, but also for the fragile ecosystem around her. Each item she placed in the basket was more than sustenance. It was a lesson in patience, foresight, and respect for life that persisted long before her arrival. By midday, the basket was full, heavy with the bounty of careful observation and labor. She lifted it to inspect her work, marveling at the small abundance she had secured. The Apache smiled faintly, noting her satisfaction. "These hands can provide," he said simply. "Even in hardship, effort and care create life." She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a combination of pride and relief. For days, survival had been dictated by uncertainty and fear, but now tangible proof of her capability rested in her arms. Returning to the cabin, they emptied the basket onto the work table. The herbs were sorted, roots cleaned, berries washed carefully with water from the small spring. She realized that domestic effort, often dismissed as simple, was in fact a form of mastery, organizing, preserving, preparing. The woven basket had facilitated her growth, teaching her that skill and patience were inseparable from survival. It was not enough to merely endure. Life required attention, method, and care. As the afternoon waned, she set the basket aside and joined the Apache by the hearth. He began to prepare a simple meal, demonstrating how the herbs could enhance nourishment or soothe discomfort. She watched, learning how small touches, the addition of a root, the correct boil time, transformed basic sustenance into something sustaining for both body and spirit. With each lesson, the rhythm of life returned, gathering, preparing, nourishing, resting. The woven basket had become a focal point of this cycle, a tangible symbol of domestic skill and the slow cultivation of life. By evening, the cabin glowed with warmth and the faint aroma of herbs and boiled roots. She sat nearby, the basket beside her, now empty, but full of promise. The Apache did not speak. His presence was enough. Outside, the wilderness remained vast and indifferent, but inside, their careful work had created a microcosm of stability, rhythm, and life reclaimed. She allowed herself a moment to imagine the future, a small garden, more baskets filled with bounty, and a life sustained not only by instinct, but by knowledge, skill, and patience. That night she placed the woven basket near the hearth, its fibers glinting faintly in the firelight. The object was simple, yet it carried lessons far beyond its physical form. It represented diligence, foresight, and the quiet accumulation of small successes, each one vital in shaping the life she hoped to protect. With the basket, she recognized the profound truth that survival and domesticity were intertwined. That tending to life in the wilderness required not just strength, but care, attention, and perseverance. The Apache sat across from her, observing the flickering flames, a steady presence in the growing darkness. She traced the weave of the basket with her fingers, imagining the hands that had made it and the life it had carried before. In that moment she understood, even in the harshest terrain, small acts of care and the tools crafted by others could guide her forward, teaching resilience, patience, and the beginnings of hope. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the distant roar of water echoed through the canyon like a warning. The widow tightened her shawl around her shoulders, the weight of the child pressing insistently against her abdomen, and followed the Apache toward a swollen river, swollen with recent rains. Its current churned dark and violent, whitecaps breaking over jagged rocks that jutted like teeth from the water's surface. The river was a trial she could not ignore. It demanded focus, courage, and careful balance. At the riverbank, she noticed a flat, smooth stone protruding from the mud, its surface polished by years of rushing water. She bent to touch it, feeling its cold hardness beneath her fingers. The Apache gestured toward it. "Step here first. The stone will test your weight, your timing, your trust in yourself." His voice was calm, low, and precise, carrying no rush, no judgment, only guidance. She hesitated, staring at the roaring water. The fear of falling, of losing herself or the child she carried, pressed upon her chest. He did not offer a hand, but stood nearby, steady as a mountain, waiting. Taking a deep breath, she placed one foot on the stone, testing its stability. It shifted slightly beneath her weight, and her heart leaped. Another step, careful and deliberate, and the stone held. The river's roar seemed to fade as she focused on rhythm and balance. Each step across the jagged rocks and slippery stones became a lesson. She learned to move deliberately, to feel the shifts in the river beneath her, to anticipate the current rather than resist it. The Apache's presence beside her, calm and unyielding, provided assurance without interference. His eyes never left her, yet he allowed her to discover the courage and skill within herself. The river stone, cold and unyielding, became her anchor, a tangible reminder that trials could be faced one careful step at a time. Midway across, the river surged unexpectedly, splashing icy water over her legs. Panic threatened to overtake her, but she gripped the stick he had given her earlier, leaning into its support. He called out instructions in quiet, measured tones, reminding her to place her weight carefully, to trust both the stone and her own balance. She obeyed, feeling the rhythm of each movement, her pulse aligning with the pulse of the river itself. When she finally reached the far bank, gasping for breath but triumphant, a strange exhilaration washed over her. The river, Once an imposing barrier had become a teacher, and she had passed its lesson. Once safe on solid ground, the Apache nodded in acknowledgement, his expression unreadable but approving. The river is patient, but it tests all who cross it. You have learned much today, not just balance, but trust, focus, and resilience. She pressed her palms against her knees, still shaking from exertion, yet a quiet satisfaction warmed her chest. She had faced fear directly and discovered strength she had not known she possessed. The river stone rested near the bank, smooth and unassuming, yet in its presence lingered the memory of trial overcome. She imagined herself returning to it in future journeys, knowing it would always offer a lesson, that fear could be met with patience. That balance was found through deliberate action, and that courage often manifested as small, steady movements rather than grand gestures. As they returned to the cabin, the widow walked with a newfound awareness. Each step on uneven terrain reminded her of the river, of the importance of focus, and of the steady guidance she had received without words. The wilderness was vast, indifferent, and often harsh. Yet within its trials were opportunities to grow, to learn, to discover hidden reserves of resilience. By evening, she sat near the hearth, the river stone tucked carefully beside her bedroll, a talisman of strength and memory. The fire crackled, sending shadows across the walls, and she felt the pulse of life returning, her own, the child's, and the quiet rhythm of the world outside. The lesson of the river lingered. Survival required courage, yes, but also mindfulness, balance, and trust in oneself. The Apache prepared a simple meal, placing a small bowl before her. She ate slowly, reflecting on the day's trial. The river's challenge, the steady guidance he provided, and the physical and emotional endurance she had summoned created a bond between them that went beyond words. Trust had been forged in action, resilience in fear, and patience in deliberate movement. As darkness fell, she placed the river stone carefully on a shelf beside the hearth, its smooth surface catching the firelight. It would remain a silent reminder that the world could be faced, that challenges could be met, and that even in the harshest wilderness, courage and trust could carve a path forward. With the stone near her, she felt steadier, stronger, and more certain that the journey, though difficult, was navigable. Dusk settled over the cabin, painting the horizon in shades of muted gold and deep violet. The widow sat near the fire, fingers tracing the contours of a small silver locket she had tucked close to her chest. The metal was cool beneath her touch, worn with time, its clasp fragile yet reliable. Inside, she had kept a faded portrait of her late husband, a tether to a life that had ended too soon, a reminder of loss she could not yet release. Tonight, something compelled her to speak, to let her grief and fear be seen. The Apache moved quietly around the cabin, stacking firewood and preparing herbs for a simple meal. He did not look directly at her, yet she felt his presence as a steady reassurance. "I never knew how much weight one can carry," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "until it was forced upon me, until the world left me alone with this life inside me." He paused, finally turning toward her, his eyes calm but penetrating. "Loss is a river," he said softly, "and all who survive it must learn to navigate its currents. Carrying grief is not weakness, it is proof that life has mattered." She nodded, feeling the truth in his words settle like ash in her chest. It was the first acknowledgement that her sorrow was neither shame nor burden. It was part of the human story, part of the journey that had brought her here. Slowly, she opened the locket, showing him the miniature portrait within. He leaned closer, studying it without judgment. "She loved well," he said quietly, "and so have you, even now." The words, simple and measured, eased a tension she had not realized was held so tightly in her chest. She felt the stirrings of trust, fragile and new, forming in the space between them. He guided her hands gently, showing how to use the herbs they had gathered, preparing a restorative tea. The quiet motions of boiling water, crushing leaves, and measuring roots created a a shared activity that eased the intensity of confession. She realized that grief, when spoken and accompanied by presence, became less isolating. In the act of preparing sustenance together, sorrow and survival intertwined, each movement a subtle negotiation between past loss and present resilience. As the fire crackled, she found herself speaking more freely, recounting memories of her husband, the quiet moments that had defined their life together, and the regrets that lingered like shadows. He listened without interruption, eyes steady, presence unwavering. She noted the absence of judgment, the careful patience in his gaze. It was a gift, one she had scarcely allowed herself to imagine in weeks of isolation. The cabin, the fire, the simple act of confession all became a sanctuary, a place where grief could coexist with trust, and sorrow could make space for hope. The locket rested in her palm, its cool weight grounding her as she spoke of dreams she had once abandoned, visions of family, of security, of connection. He spoke then softly, "What we have now is fragile. But fragility does not mean failure. Strength is often quiet, measured, and built in moments like this." She felt a shiver of understanding. Trust and intimacy were not instantaneous. They were cultivated slowly, like a seed nurtured in careful soil. Night deepened, and the wind rustled the cabin's walls. Outside, the wilderness remained vast and indifferent, yet inside, a fragile intimacy had formed. She held the locket close once more, realizing that memory could coexist with the present and that confession could transform isolation into shared experience. The Apache's silent presence beside her became a constant, an unspoken promise that survival and companionship were intertwined. Before sleep claimed her, she whispered a question into the firelight. Could she allow herself to hope, to accept protection, to let the past coexist with what might yet come? The locket glinted faintly in the shadows, a reminder that life persisted beyond grief, that trust could be earned, and that connection, slow, deliberate, and patient, was possible even in the harshest wilderness. In that quiet hour, she understood that the act of confession was not weakness. It was the first step toward embracing life once more. The silver locket rested beside her bedroll, a tangible bridge between memory and the promise of guidance, companionship, and perhaps eventually, love. The morning light filtered through the cabin, pale and cautious, as if the wilderness itself still held judgment over the fragile life within. The widow awoke to the sound of birds skittering among branches outside and the soft crackle of the Apache tending the hearth. Her gaze fell upon a small flint knife resting on the table, a relic of past travelers, its edge chipped but capable. She reached for it, feeling the raw coolness of the flint beneath her fingers, and a quiet determination surged through her. This tool, simple yet precise, offered the means to exert control over an uncertain world. The Apache noticed her interest and said nothing at first, simply watching as she examined the knife's curves and imperfections. Then he spoke, voice low and steady. "It has been used to provide, to defend, to endure. You may learn the same." He guided her through basic techniques, cutting roots without wasting them, scraping bark to use for fire, and carving small notches into wood to mark direction or distance. The knife was more than a tool. It was a teacher, a means of connecting her body and mind to the land that had seemed so relentless. Venturing outside, she tested her skills, slicing carefully through tough roots and thick stems, feeling the precision of the knife against the stubborn resistance of nature. Each cut demanded attention, mindfulness, and patience. The wilderness remained indifferent, but the knife allowed her to interact with it on her terms, to claim small victories over hunger and discomfort, and to transform fear into action. The Apache watched silently, his presence grounding her as she worked. When her hand wavered or the blade threatened to slip, he offered guidance not through command, but through steady demonstration. Each movement became a lesson in balance, focus, and intentionality. The act of using the knife, of shaping raw elements into useful forms, awakened a sense of agency she had feared lost. She realized that survival depended not only on endurance, but also on the skillful application of knowledge and tools. By midday, she had gathered a small cache of roots, cut with care and precision, enough to supplement the herbs and plants stored from previous days. The Apache nodded, approving not just her effort, but the methodical attention she had given each task. Survival, he said, is shaped by both courage and skill. The one without the other falters. She understood the truth of his words. Courage alone might carry her across a river or through a storm, but skill, the careful mastery of tools, observation, and movement, would sustain life in the long term. They spent the afternoon maintaining the cabin and the surrounding area, using the flint knife to carve small notches into posts marking boundaries, trim overgrown branches that threatened to block sunlight, and shape wooden stakes for gathering firewood. Each action, deliberate and measured, reinforced the rhythm of life in the wilderness. The knife was no longer simply a survival implement. It had become an extension of her will, a bridge between instinct and mastery. As evening approached, she paused to rest, the knife laid carefully on the table beside her. The Apache prepared a simple meal from the gathered roots and herbs, his presence steady and unassuming. She observed the knife's edge catching the firelight, sharp and resilient despite the roughness of its origin. It symbolized a quiet truth. Survival demanded respect for tools, attention to detail, and a willingness to engage actively with life rather than passively endure it. Night descended gradually, and the wilderness outside the cabin seemed to settle into its nocturnal rhythm. She traced the edge of the flint knife with her finger, reflecting on the lessons of the day. Courage, patience, and skill had allowed her to navigate small challenges, and she felt the first inklings of confidence that might one day extend to larger trials. The knife was a tangible reminder that survival was not just a matter of instinct or luck, but of thoughtful, deliberate action executed with attention and care. Before she slept, she placed the flint knife beside her bedroll, a quiet talisman of agency and preparedness. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, yet within the cabin, she felt a subtle sense of mastery. The blade had taught her that even in a harsh, indifferent world, careful hands, focused attention, and courage combined could carve a path forward. In the sharpness of flint and the steadiness of her hands, she glimpsed the beginnings of resilience, the quiet assertion of life, and the strength she would need to meet the days ahead. The morning sun spilled softly into the cabin, illuminating the dust that hovered like tiny specters in the air. The widow stretched slowly, her body still tender from recent exertions, and noticed a worn journal tucked beneath a bundle of firewood. Its leather cover was cracked and softened with age, and the pages inside were yellowed, edges curling from years of neglect. She hesitated, sensing that this was no ordinary object. The journal seemed to carry whispers of past lives, lessons etched in ink and memory. The Apache watched her quietly, offering no comment. He understood, perhaps, that some truths must be discovered rather than dictated. She opened the book with care, the binding groaning softly. The entries were brief, sparse observations about the land, about survival, and about those who had lived and labored in the wilderness before her. Each line, though faded, carried a deliberate precision, notes on which plants could heal, which rivers were safe to cross, which storms to anticipate. She read aloud softly, savoring each word, letting the rhythm of the sentences anchor her thoughts. It was as though the voices of those long gone had reached across time to offer counsel, patience, and insight. The Apache joined her silently, sitting nearby and adding nothing, allowing the journal's wisdom to unfold naturally. The cabin felt suddenly larger, more alive, not merely a refuge, but a repository of experience and survival. By midday, she began to transcribe some of the entries into a fresh sheet of parchment, wanting to preserve the lessons for herself and, one day, for her child. The process was slow and deliberate. She traced the faint ink with reverence, understanding that these words had guided others through harsh winters, harsh lands, and uncertain futures. With every sentence copied, she felt a connection to a continuum of life, a sense of belonging to those who had endured before her. The journal also held personal reflections, small confessions of fear, hope, and perseverance. She felt less alone in her own doubts, realizing that even those who survived carried moments of hesitation, despair, and uncertainty. The Apache glanced at her periodically, silently affirming that acknowledgement of fear was not weakness, but an essential part of growth. She understood that survival demanded honesty with oneself as much as skill with the land. Afternoon shadows stretched across the cabin as she studied the journal further. One entry described a storm that had swept through the region decades earlier, noting the signs that preceded it and the precautions that saved lives. Another recounted how a traveler had navigated treacherous terrain with nothing but observation and patience. She felt the weight of these experiences, recognizing that preparation, mindfulness, and the accumulation of knowledge were as vital as strength or courage. The journal had become a mentor, teaching her the art of deliberate, informed action. She paused to look at the Apache, who had been preparing a modest meal while she read. He offered a small nod, and she realized that his own survival had been guided by similar principles: observation, careful planning, and respect for the land. The journal and his presence together reinforced an essential truth: wisdom could be found in objects, in action, and in those who patiently shared knowledge. By evening, the cabin glowed with warm light, and she placed the worn journal beside the hearth. Its pages slightly ruffled but intact. She felt a sense of accomplishment, not only in understanding the knowledge it contained, but also in recognizing her capacity to learn, absorb, and apply it. The journal had provided structure to her thoughts, guidance for her hands, and a bridge between her fears and her growing confidence. As the wind whispered outside and darkness deepened, she traced the edges of the journal's cover with her fingers. It was more than ink and leather. It was a testament to endurance, a chronicle of human persistence, and a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, guidance and wisdom could be found if one took the time to observe, reflect, and act. With the journal nearby, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a growing clarity about the path she and her child would walk, and a quiet reassurance that knowledge, patience, and careful attention could turn survival into life. The Apache sat across from her, watching the fire, and she realized that, together with the lessons from the journal, they were forming a rhythm of life: reflection, preparation, action, and rest. Outside, the wilderness remained vast and indifferent, but inside, the worn journal's presence lent structure, insight, and hope. The morning sun broke gently over the horizon, casting amber light through the gaps in the cabin walls. The widow noticed a pair of beaded moccasins resting near the doorway. Their leather was soft and worn, the intricate beadwork delicate yet purposeful. Each pattern told a story she could not yet read fully, a record of the hands that had created them and the paths they had walked. She bent to examine them, feeling the careful stitching under her fingertips. They were more than footwear. They were a promise of guidance, a bridge between history and the steps she would take into the wilderness. The Apache watched silently, allowing her to explore the moccasins without interruption. Finally he spoke, voice calm and deliberate. "These were made to protect, to honor the ground walked upon. They carry the strength of those who came before." She understood at once that they were not just practical. They were symbols of endurance, skill, and respect for life, teaching that every journey demanded attention and reverence. She slipped the moccasins onto her feet, marveling at how comfortably they fit despite their age. The leather molded naturally to her shape, and the beadwork caught the morning light with subtle brilliance. Stepping outside, she felt a connection to the land that had been absent before, an awareness of each stone, root, and patch of uneven soil beneath her feet. The moccasins seemed to guide her, each step deliberate, balanced, and cautious. The Apache led her along a narrow path that hugged the edge of a small ravine. He spoke of rhythm in movement, of reading the ground like a map, of respecting each step so that fatigue, injury, or misstep could be minimized. She focused intently, letting the moccasins become extensions of herself, carrying her safely over slippery rocks and loose soil. With each step, she felt a growing trust in the wilderness, in the Apache's guidance, and most surprisingly, in her own body. By midday, they reached a small grove where wild plants thrived despite harsh conditions. The Apache instructed her in gathering without harm, selecting roots, herbs, and berries carefully, while maintaining balance on uneven terrain. The moccasins protected her feet, yes, but they also served as reminders of the care required in every action. She realized that survival demanded attention, not only to immediate needs, but also to the environment, a respect for life that extended beyond her own existence. As they worked, she spoke softly of her fears and uncertainties, the child she carried, the unpredictability of the wilderness, the fragile trust forming between herself and the man who had saved her. He listened without interruption, offering only measured guidance and steady presence. She began to understand that trust was built not through grand gestures, but through consistent, deliberate action, through shared work, patience, and attention to detail. The moccasins, a gift of past hands, had become a medium through which she experienced that lesson directly, grounding each step with purpose and care. Afternoon brought a challenge, crossing a shallow stream where rocks shifted underfoot. She hesitated, fear prickling her senses, but the moccasins gripped the stones with surprising stability. The Apache offered quiet instruction. Move slowly. Feel each stone. Let the ground support you. She did, step by careful step, feeling the confidence build with each successful crossing. When she reached the opposite bank, she exhaled, a weight lifted from her chest. The moccasins had been more than protection. They had been teachers, providing trust, balance, and courage through the simple act of walking deliberately. Returning to the cabin, she carefully removed the moccasins and placed them near the hearth, their beadwork glinting in the fading light. They had carried her through both literal and metaphorical challenges, teaching patience, respect, and trust. She realized that survival in this harsh land was not merely endurance. It was awareness, care, and intentionality in every action. That evening, as she sat beside the fire, the moccasins at her side, she reflected on the day. The wilderness remained vast and indifferent, yet within the boundaries of the cabin and through deliberate steps in the open land, she discovered a rhythm, a sense of agency, and the beginning of trust in the Apache, in herself, and even in life that continued despite loss and uncertainty. She traced the intricate beads with her fingertips, appreciating the hands that had crafted them, and the wisdom embedded within each stitch. The moccasins were now hers in both practical and symbolic ways. They embodied protection, heritage, and the courage to move forward step by step through a wilderness that tested not only body but spirit. In the quiet glow of the firelight, she placed the beaded moccasins beside her bedroll. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, indifferent and eternal, yet inside, the lessons of trust, patience, and care lingered like embers. She understood at last that survival was inseparable from respect, skill, and the courage to take one deliberate step after another. The dawn was pale and trembling, the sky streaked with soft pinks and greys. The widow rose slowly, feeling the weight of her child, yet undiminished by the morning chill. Her eyes fell upon a feathered headdress resting on a high shelf near the cabin wall. Its feathers were worn but intact, some tipped with faint traces of color that had survived years of exposure. She approached it cautiously, sensing that it carried meaning far beyond its appearance. The Apache watched quietly from across the room, his gaze steady and approving. "It is not for decoration," he said simply. "It carries guidance, honor, and memory. It will teach you as much as you are ready to learn." She reached for the headdress, feeling the softness of the feathers and the weight of history embedded in their arrangement. Each feather seemed to whisper a story, lessons of survival, respect for the land, and the quiet endurance of generations. As she held it, she realized that the object demanded reverence, patience, and attention, qualities that had become essential in the wilderness. The headdress was a symbol, a connection to a lineage of knowledge and resilience that she had only begun to understand. The Apache instructed her in the significance of each feather, each bead, and the careful way the headdress had been assembled. "Every element represents a principle," he explained. "Patience, foresight, respect, courage, and honor. To wear it is to accept responsibility for these values, to carry them into the world with humility and purpose." She listened attentively, understanding that this lesson extended beyond ceremonial use. It applied to every action, every choice she made in the wilderness. He guided her through a simple ritual, showing how to position the headdress so that it rested comfortably yet securely. The process was deliberate, reflective, requiring mindfulness and balance. As she adjusted it on her head, she felt a subtle shift within herself, a sense of grounding, a quiet strength, and the awareness that her actions mattered not only for her survival, but for the life growing inside her. The headdress became a tangible affirmation that she was part of something larger, a continuum of experience, wisdom, and endurance. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth, and she ventured onto the small path leading from the cabin. The headdress shifted lightly with each step, a gentle reminder of the values it symbolized. She moved with greater care, awareness heightened, sensing every rock, branch, and patch of uneven soil. Each motion was deliberate, reflecting lessons learned over weeks: observation, patience, balance, and respect. The wilderness seemed less threatening now, more like a partner in the slow, deliberate choreography of survival. By midday, they reached a small meadow where wildflowers clung stubbornly to rocky soil. The Apache demonstrated how to identify medicinal plants, instructing her on preparation and careful harvesting. She followed closely, feeling the headdress lightly brush her shoulders, a constant symbol of guidance and protection. The object taught her humility, to move deliberately, to respect life, and to recognize that wisdom often comes from observation rather than force. As they worked, she spoke of her fears and hopes, her voice quiet but steady. The headdress seemed to amplify the gravity of her words, giving them weight and significance. He listened without interruption, acknowledging her reflections with measured nods and occasional insight. She realized that trust and understanding were built not in haste, but through shared moments, deliberate actions, and careful attention to both the environment and the human connections within it. Afternoon, shadows stretched across the meadow as she practiced the techniques he had shown, adjusting the headdress each time to maintain comfort and balance. She felt a rhythm emerge between body, mind, and the land, a rhythm informed by caution, skill, and reflection. The headdress, though ceremonial, grounded her in practical wisdom. It symbolized endurance, guidance, and the honor of carrying forward lessons from the past, while forging a path for the future. Returning to the cabin, she placed the feathered headdress carefully on the high shelf, its feathers catching the fading sunlight. The Apache prepared a modest meal, and they sat in companionable silence, the lessons of the day settling into their consciousness. The wilderness remained vast and indifferent, yet within the boundaries of their cabin and through deliberate attention, they had cultivated a rhythm of life, observation, learning, practice, and reflection. That night, as the fire crackled softly, she considered the headdress once more. It was more than an object of ceremony. It was a teacher, a talisman of endurance, and a reminder that honor, patience, and careful observation were essential to survival and life. Holding its lessons close, she felt a quiet strength, a deepened trust in the Apache, and a growing awareness of her own capability. In the stillness, she understood that resilience was cultivated slowly through reflection, deliberate action, and reverence for what came before. Morning light filtered softly through the cabin, casting long golden shafts across the wooden floor. The widow rose and noticed a carved walking stick leaning against the wall. Its surface was etched with primitive symbols, lines and spirals that seemed to narrate a story of travel, survival, and wisdom handed down through generations. She reached for it, feeling the cool, smooth wood under her fingers. The stick was more than a tool. It was a symbol of resilience and support, both physical and spiritual, in the face of the wilderness's relentless challenges. The Apache watched quietly as she held it. "It has guided many who have walked these lands," he said softly. "It bears the weight of those who needed balance and courage, and it will serve you in the same way." She understood that it was not merely a physical support, but a metaphorical one, a reminder that even in isolation, guidance and stability could be found if she accepted the wisdom around her. Slipping the walking stick into her hand, she followed him out into the surrounding forest. The terrain was uneven, strewn with roots, stones, and fallen branches. Each step demanded careful attention, and the stick became an extension of her body, probing ahead, steadying her balance, and lending confidence with each movement. She realized that it was not simply the strength of her legs that allowed her to navigate the terrain, but the collaboration between body, mind, and the guidance of the stick. The Apache spoke intermittently, pointing out subtle changes in the landscape: a patch of moss covering a slippery rock, a weakened branch that might snap under weight, or a slight incline that required adjustment in gait. She followed his advice, learning to anticipate challenges rather than react blindly. The walking stick provided a constant tactile reminder of support, allowing her to engage fully with the wilderness without fear or hesitation. Midway through their trek, they approached a steep slope leading to a small plateau. Her heart pounded at the sight. The incline was treacherous, and a misstep could have severe consequences. She gripped the walking stick firmly, planting it carefully with each step, feeling the reassurance of its presence beneath her weight. Step by step she ascended, her confidence growing with every deliberate motion. The Apache's calm presence behind her reinforced the lesson. Courage was rooted in preparation, observation, and the acceptance of support rather than reckless independence. At the plateau, they paused to rest. She traced the symbols carved into the stick, realizing that they mirrored the lessons she had been learning: perseverance, awareness, patience, and respect. Each mark was a guide, a reminder of the journeys undertaken before and the paths still ahead. The Apache shared quiet stories of travelers who had relied on similar tools to navigate hardship, emphasizing that survival was not only physical, but also intellectual and spiritual. She felt a deep connection to these unseen predecessors, their experiences woven into the stick she now held. As the afternoon sun moved across the sky, they descended into a small valley, the stick once again steadying her along uneven ground and slippery stones. She marveled at the practicality of this simple object, how one piece of wood could transform fear into confidence, hesitation into deliberate movement. She realized that survival was rarely about brute strength alone. It was about using resources wisely, observing carefully, and leaning on guidance when needed. The walking stick embodied all these lessons. Returning to the cabin, she leaned the stick against the hearth, noting its dual role as both tool and teacher. She reflected on the day's journey, each step taken with care, each decision informed by observation and guidance, had transformed what might have been treacherous into a navigable path. The wilderness, though still vast and indifferent, had been made manageable through thoughtful action and support. That evening, as firelight flickered across the cabin walls, she realized that the walking stick was more than wood etched with symbols. It was a testament to patience, experience, and trust. It reminded her that guidance, whether from objects, environment, or people, could be accepted without diminishing one's independence. The stick represented balance in every sense: physical, emotional, and spiritual. She settled near the hearth, resting her hand on the walking stick, feeling the calm reassurance it provided. The Apache prepared a simple meal, and she observed the quiet rhythm of their coexistence: learning, support, reflection, and action. The carved walking stick had become a symbol of resilience, a tangible anchor in the wilderness, and a reminder that even in moments of uncertainty, steady guidance could light the path forward. The morning mist clung to the edges of the cabin like a delicate veil. The widow discovered a small copper compass tucked into a leather pouch beneath the cabin's main table. Its metal casing was worn, dulled by years of handling, yet the needle spun smoothly, unwavering in its determination to point north. She held it in her palm, feeling the weight and balance, and recognized immediately that it represented more than direction. It was a metaphor for clarity, for the steady pursuit of purpose amid the uncertainties of the wilderness. The Apache noticed her curiosity and nodded. It has guided many travelers long before us. The compass does not carry you. It teaches you how to find your path. His voice was calm, measured, echoing the wisdom of experience. She understood that the compass demanded attentiveness and patience, qualities she had been cultivating in her own journey. To use it well required not just following the needle, but understanding one's surroundings and intentions. She slipped the compass into her pocket and stepped outside, letting the morning light warm her face. The wilderness stretched endlessly before her, rolling hills, dense forests, and uneven terrain. But for the first time she felt the possibility of direction. The compass became a focus point, a tangible tool to interpret the land and plan each step carefully. Its presence provided reassurance that decisions could be guided by reason, not fear. The Apache led her to a ridge overlooking a small valley, explaining landmarks and natural signs, the growth patterns of trees, the angles of river bends, and the position of the sun. Using the compass alongside these indicators, she practiced triangulating locations, understanding orientation, and plotting a course. Step by step, she began to see the logic beneath the apparent chaos of the wilderness. The compass was a teacher of observation as much as direction, guiding her both physically and mentally. By midday, they ventured along a narrow trail, the compass clasped tightly in her hand. She noticed how the needle adjusted subtly as the terrain shifted, and she began to anticipate changes, learning to navigate with both precision and intuition. Crossing rocky inclines and shallow streams, she relied on the compass for orientation, but on her senses for safety. The combination of tangible guidance and experiential awareness created a rhythm that was both practical and meditative. During a pause, she reflected on the symbolism of the compass. Life, much like the wilderness, was full of unpredictable turns, obstacles, and hidden dangers. Yet a clear direction, coupled with mindfulness and care, allowed one to move forward confidently. The compass reminded her that purpose and focus were cultivated through attention and deliberate action, not recklessness or blind hope. She realized that just as the needle always returned to true north, her intentions could guide her steps, even when the path seemed unclear. The Apache shared quiet stories of travelers who had relied on similar instruments, emphasizing that the compass was a guide, but not a master. It could not make decisions, predict dangers, or substitute for experience. Its lesson was in combination. Direction, observation, and judgment together enabled survival and progress. She felt the truth of his words settle deep within her, resonating with the confidence she had been building with each challenge she faced. Afternoon light softened as they descended toward a small stream. Using the compass, she marked landmarks and recorded observations, noting the relative positions of trees, rocks, and distant hills. Each action strengthened her sense of agency. The wilderness, once overwhelming, now seemed like a vast puzzle she could approach methodically. The compass, small and unassuming, had become a powerful tool of clarity and reassurance, guiding not just her steps, but her understanding of the land. Returning to the cabin, she placed the compass on a shelf alongside the other artifacts she had collected: the river stone, the silver locket, the flint knife, the worn journal, and the beaded moccasins. Together, they formed a constellation of survival, wisdom, and growth. Each object reinforced lessons of balance, trust, skill, reflection, and now direction. The compass, in particular, symbolized purpose, the knowledge that even in an indifferent wilderness, one could find orientation through careful observation and deliberate action. As night settled, she held the compass in her hands, feeling its weight and the subtle pull of the needle. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, indifferent and eternal. Yet within the cabin, she felt clarity, patience, and resolve. The copper compass was not merely an instrument, it was a teacher, a reminder that with attention, foresight, and steady hands, even the vastest wilderness could be navigated, and the uncertain journey of life could be approached with intention. The first light of dawn filtered through the cabin's cracks, casting pale stripes across the wooden floor. The widow's eyes fell upon a woven basket resting beside the hearth. Its fibers were sturdy but supple, the interlacing precise and deliberate. She lifted it carefully, feeling the weight and balance, and understood instinctively that it was more than a container. It was a vessel of preparation, patience, and the labor of hands that had learned to sustain life in a harsh environment. The Apache observed her without comment, his presence calm and steady. Finally he spoke, voice low and measured. "The basket teaches as much as it carries. To gather well, to store carefully, is to respect both what the land gives and what life demands." She nodded, realizing that the object carried lessons beyond its practical use. Attentiveness, foresight, and deliberate action were woven into its very structure, much like the fibers themselves. Stepping outside, she held the basket in her hands and surveyed the surrounding forest. The wilderness, once overwhelming in its scale, now appeared navigable, offering both sustenance and challenge. The Apache guided her toward a thicket where roots, berries, and edible greens thrived despite the rocky soil. He demonstrated the careful selection of plants, emphasizing the importance of leaving enough behind for regeneration. Each piece placed in the basket was deliberate, measured, and mindful, a practice that taught patience and respect for the natural world. She followed his lead, selecting roots with care, gently loosening them from the earth, and arranging herbs and berries neatly in the basket. The act of gathering became meditative, a rhythm that combined focus, awareness, and deliberate effort. The basket itself offered both physical support and symbolic guidance, reminding her that preparation and care were essential to survival. Every motion was a dialogue between hands, mind, and environment. By midday, the basket was filled with a modest harvest. She examined the contents carefully, noting the balance between nourishment and restraint. The Apache nodded in approval. "Life is a series of choices," he said quietly. "To take only what is needed, to preserve what is valuable, is a measure of wisdom as much as survival." She felt the weight of his words, recognizing that each action, even the simple act of gathering, carried consequence and required mindfulness. The afternoon was spent tending the cabin and arranging the gathered supplies. She washed roots, sorted herbs, and layered berries carefully to prevent spoilage. The basket, though simple, had become a central tool in her understanding of life in the wilderness. Organization, foresight, and care were as vital as courage or strength. She realized that the lessons she learned through these artifacts were cumulative, each one reinforcing the others. Courage from the river stone, trust from the silver locket, skill from the flint knife, reflection from the worn journal, stability from the walking stick, direction from the copper compass, and now patience and provision from the woven basket. Even as the sun began its descent, the widow continued to handle the basket with care, appreciating the meticulous craftsmanship and the quiet guidance embedded in its structure. The act of gathering and storing was no longer a chore, but a practice in mindfulness, discipline, and deliberate planning. It connected her to the land, to the rhythms of life, and to the quiet wisdom of those who had lived before her. When the Apache returned with a small bundle of firewood, she felt a deep sense of partnership and shared purpose. They worked side by side, each action deliberate, the basket resting nearby as a testament to effort and foresight. She understood that survival was a balance of observation, preparation, and action, lessons that extended beyond the wilderness into every aspect of her existence. Night fell gently, and she placed the basket beside the hearth, its contents organized and secure. It was more than a container. It was a teacher, a guide, and a symbol of patience and provision. She felt the weight of responsibility for her own life and that of her unborn child, tempered by the quiet reassurance that deliberate action and careful preparation could transform fear into stability. Before sleep claimed her, she traced the weave of the basket, reflecting on the day's work. Each fiber intertwined with lessons of observation, care, and respect, reinforcing the understanding that survival and life itself required deliberate attention, patience, and a steady hand. The woven basket had carried more than roots and berries. It had carried wisdom, grounding her in the present and offering guidance for the uncertain days ahead. The morning light entered the cabin with a gentle warmth, illuminating a small clay pot tucked into a corner. Its surface was rough, earthy, and unpolished, yet the shape was functional and intentional. The widow picked it up carefully, sensing the weight of its purpose. It was a vessel not merely for holding food or water, but for preserving life, for slow transformation, and for the measured attention that survival demanded. The Apache watched her quietly, eyes calm and observant. "This pot is humble," he said softly, "but it teaches patience. To preserve, to nourish, to respect what is inside, that is the measure of care." She understood immediately that it was not just a tool. It was a lesson in intention, foresight, and stewardship. She set the pot on the table and cleaned it gently, removing dust and remnants of previous use. Then she prepared a simple mixture of roots, herbs, and fresh water, placing it carefully inside. The Apache guided her in the process of slow simmering, explaining how controlled heat could extract nutrients, blend flavors, and transform raw elements into something sustaining. The process demanded attention and respect. Each step required deliberate timing, measured effort, and observation. The pot seemed to demand quiet reflection as much as practical use. She found herself speaking softly to it, almost unconsciously narrating the day, her hopes, her fears, and the quiet anticipation of the life she carried within her. Each stir, each careful addition was both ritual and instruction, a practice in mindfulness, focus, and transformation. The wilderness, vast and indifferent, felt slightly more manageable within this intimate exchange of care. By midday, the simmering mixture had melded into a nourishing broth. She tasted it cautiously, savoring the warmth and subtle flavors, feeling a sense of accomplishment in creating something sustaining from simple ingredients. The clay pot had transformed humble elements into life-sustaining nourishment, teaching that attention, patience, and respect could yield results beyond immediate expectations. The Apache joined her at the table, observing her work with quiet approval. "In the simplest actions wisdom resides," he said. "To care for what is given, to nurture it, to allow it time to become what it can be, this is survival and much more. It is life itself." She nodded, feeling the resonance of his words settle deeply into her consciousness. The pot, humble yet powerful, had become a teacher, showing her that care and patience were forms of strength, not weakness. Afternoon light softened the cabin as she continued to use the pot, reheating the broth for both sustenance and comfort. She reflected on the cumulative lessons of all the artifacts she had encountered: the river stone, silver locket, flint knife, worn journal, beaded moccasins, feathered headdress, walking stick, copper compass, woven basket, and now the clay pot. Each had conveyed resilience, patience, observation, courage, and trust. The pot's lesson was unique in its quiet insistence that transformation required deliberate care. That nourishment was both literal and symbolic. The wilderness outside remained vast, indifferent and occasionally threatening. Yet within the cabin, she felt a growing sense of competence. The clay pot reminded her that small, careful actions could produce meaningful results. Attention to detail, patience in process, and respect for materials or for life itself were essential to survival and to shaping a future. Each meal prepared in the pot was a reaffirmation that she could sustain herself, her child, and the fragile trust forming between herself and the Apache. Evening approached, and she set the pot beside the hearth, still warm, still carrying the essence of the day's labor. She felt gratitude, not only for its utility, but for the lessons it embodied: patience, nurturing, transformation, and attentiveness. The pot had become a quiet symbol of agency, showing that deliberate, careful action could transform uncertainty into sustenance, fear into provision. Before sleep, she traced the rounded surface of the clay pot with her fingertips, reflecting on the day's lessons. It was more than a container. It was a teacher of patience, nourishment, and respect for the natural rhythms of life. In its humble form, it carried profound truth. Survival was not merely endurance, but careful engagement with the world, attention to small acts, and the understanding that care, when applied thoughtfully, transformed both what was held and the one who held it. The morning sun crept slowly across the cabin floor, illuminating the hand-carved wooden bowl resting atop a rough-hewn shelf. Its surface was polished from years of handling, and faint etchings of swirling patterns traced its rim. The widow lifted it with care, sensing that this simple object carried lessons beyond its utilitarian function. The bowl was a vessel not only for nourishment, but for contemplation, for marking the rhythm of daily life, and for sharing sustenance that could strengthen both body and spirit. The Apache observed silently, as he often did, his eyes calm and watchful. "This bowl is older than it looks," he said quietly. "It has held life, shared meals, and taught patience. Each time you use it, you honor those who came before and those who will follow." She realized immediately that the bowl was more than a container. It was a symbol of connection, continuity, and reflection. That morning, she gathered herbs, berries, and carefully cleaned roots, placing them in the bowl with deliberate attention. The Apache guided her in arranging the ingredients to maximize their utility and flavor, explaining that preparation itself was an act of mindfulness. Each motion, washing, cutting, arranging, was performed with care, turning sustenance into ritual, labor into meditation. She carried the bowl outside to the small clearing behind the cabin, where sunlight filtered through the canopy in soft beams. Sitting cross-legged, she reflected on the day's tasks and the path that had brought her here. The wooden bowl rested in her lap, grounding her thoughts and offering a tangible focus for reflection. She stirred the contents gently, feeling the rhythm of her own hands synchronize with the natural flow of life around her. Each motion was purposeful, deliberate, and mindful, a practice she had learned through the artifacts that now filled her cabin. By midday, she had prepared a nourishing meal, the aroma rising into the air, mingling with the earthy scent of the forest. The Apache joined her, and they shared the contents of the wooden bowl in quiet communion. Eating from the same vessel, they acknowledged their shared presence, the trust forming between them and the ongoing effort to survive together. The bowl became a silent witness to their bond, a symbol of collaboration and reflection. As they ate, she contemplated the patterns etched into the wood. Each swirl and line seemed to mirror the twists and turns of her own journey, the hardships endured, the lessons learned, and the subtle triumphs that had brought her to this moment. The bowl's simple design carried the weight of experience, reminding her that every life, every act, and every choice left a trace, however subtle. On the path ahead, afternoon light softened as they returned to the cabin. The bowl emptied, but still imbued with significance. She carefully washed it and placed it back on the shelf, reflecting on the lessons it imparted: mindfulness, connection, and reverence for sustenance in all its forms. The act of preparing, sharing, and appreciating food became a metaphor for life itself, teaching her that attention, care, and reflection could transform routine acts into meaningful rituals. Later, she used the bowl to measure herbs and roots, practicing precision and order. understanding that the smallest details mattered in both survival and the cultivation of trust. The Apache observed, offering occasional guidance without imposing direction, allowing her to internalize the lessons organically. Each act reinforced patience, observation, and respect for the resources and relationships around her. By evening, the wooden bowl rested near the hearth, polished and ready for tomorrow's use. Its presence reminded her that life, even in a harsh wilderness, could be structured, meaningful, and shared. Through careful attention, deliberate action, and reflective engagement, she could nourish herself and her child, honor the land, and build a rhythm of life grounded in respect and continuity. As the fire crackled softly and the wind whispered outside, she traced the etchings one final time before sleep, reflecting on the day. The hand-carved wooden bowl had taught her that sustenance was more than food. It was care, connection, and mindfulness. In its quiet presence, she understood that survival depended not only on courage and skill, but also on reflection, preparation, and the thoughtful sharing of life's simple gifts. Dawn arrived with a pale, gentle light, filtering through the cracks in the cabin walls and casting soft shadows across the floor. The widow noticed a painted stone tucked into a corner near the hearth. Its surface was smooth, worn from time, yet faint symbols remained visible, lines and curves that seemed to pulse with silent significance. She picked it up carefully, feeling the cool weight in her palm. The stone was not merely decorative. It carried memory, a tangible link to the lives and lessons of those who had navigated the wilderness before her. The Apache regarded her quietly, nodding once. "This stone marks journeys and remembrance," he said softly. "It teaches that life is a series of steps, each leaving its own mark. To carry memory with care is to honor both the past and the path ahead." She understood immediately that the stone's value lay not in its appearance, but in its lesson, reflection, legacy, and awareness. She held it while stepping outside, feeling the crisp morning air brush against her face. The wilderness stretched beyond the cabin, wild and untamed, yet the painted stone offered an anchor, a quiet reminder that even in isolation, one could maintain connection to lineage, history, and learned wisdom. She turned it in her hands, tracing the faded symbols and imagining the lives that had touched it. Each etched line a story of resilience, survival, and quiet endurance. The Apache guided her to a nearby stream, where they paused to observe the flow of water and the patterns of stones along its banks. He explained how each ripple, each stone, told a story, much like the painted rock she carried. "Notice the currents," he instructed. "The water moves, but the stones endure. They are shaped, but they remain. We too are shaped by experiences, yet the essence of what we carry remains." She reflected on his words, sensing a deeper understanding forming. The stone was both literal and symbolic, a teacher of patience, endurance, and reflection. By midday, they had collected wild roots and herbs along the stream's edge, carefully examining each plant before adding it to their supplies. The painted stone remained in her hand, grounding her actions, reminding her that attention to detail was essential and that every step, every choice was part of a larger continuum. She marveled at how the simple act of holding it focused her mind and sharpened her senses. Linking past lessons to present actions, returning to the cabin, she set the stone on the table, alongside the other artifacts she had learned from over the past weeks: the river stone, silver locket, flint knife, worn journal, beaded moccasins, feathered headdress, walking stick, copper compass, woven basket, clay pot, and hand-carved wooden bowl. Together, these items formed a constellation of survival, wisdom, and reflection, each reinforcing the others. The painted stone stood out for its subtle insistence on legacy, memory, and mindfulness. The Apache prepared a modest meal while she examined the stone further. Its faded symbols seemed to convey movement, time, and continuity, a reminder that even as life unfolded unpredictably, the lessons and endurance of those who came before remained present. She reflected on her own journey, recognizing the ways in which she had changed, the skills she had acquired, the patience she had cultivated, and the trust she had built with the man who had saved her. Each experience, like the symbols on the stone, left an imprint. Afternoon shadows stretched across the cabin, and she carried the painted stone with her as she inspected their small garden plot and organized gathered provisions. The presence of the stone heightened her awareness, reinforcing deliberate movement, careful observation, and thoughtful engagement with both the land and her surroundings. The wilderness, vast and indifferent, now felt structured and navigable, informed by reflection and respect for continuity. As evening approached, she placed the painted stone near the hearth, its surface catching the firelight. She traced the symbols one final time for the day, contemplating their quiet power. The stone was more than an artifact. It was a teacher, a reminder that memory, legacy, and awareness were as essential to survival as strength, skill, or courage. Night settled over the cabin, and she held the painted stone in her hands before placing it carefully on the shelf. Its presence carried reassurance, grounding her in continuity and reflection. She understood that survival required more than mere endurance. It demanded respect for history, deliberate action, and acknowledgement of the lessons embedded in objects, the land, and the people who had come before. The painted stone offered her clarity, connection, and perspective, a guide for both the present and the uncertain days ahead. The final morning arrived with a gentle hush, the sun spilling soft gold across the cabin floor. The widow's eyes fell on a woven blanket draped over a chair. Its fibers were sturdy, interlaced with patterns that told of care, patience, and the hands that had created it. She lifted it, feeling its comforting weight and warmth. The blanket was more than fabric. It represented protection, continuity, and the unspoken bond forged through shared hardship and trust. The Apache observed her quietly, a faint smile on his weathered face. It has kept travelers safe, carried warmth across long nights, and marked the end of journeys as much as their beginnings, he said. She understood immediately. The blanket symbolized not only comfort, but the culmination of the lessons imparted by every artifact she had encountered: the river stone, silver locket, flint knife, worn journal, beaded moccasins, feathered headdress, walking stick, copper compass, woven basket, clay pot, hand-carved wooden bowl, and painted stone. Each had guided her, shaped her understanding, and strengthened her resolve. She spread the blanket across the cabin floor, kneeling to smooth its surface. It was warm and welcoming, a tangible expression of safety and care. She reflected on the journey she had undertaken, from abandonment in the harsh wilderness to the slow cultivation of skill, patience, and trust. The blanket was a symbol of completion, of a cycle in which fear, uncertainty, and solitude had transformed into confidence, understanding, and connection. Morning chores began, the routines that now felt familiar and essential. She gathered water, tended to the small garden, and prepared herbs and roots, using all she had learned from the artifacts that had shaped her daily existence. Each motion was deliberate, reflective, and informed by experience. The blanket laid near the hearth was a quiet observer of her progress, a reminder that care and consistency brought both comfort and resilience. By midday, she and the Apache shared a simple meal beside the blanket. They sat close, the warmth of its fibers brushing against them as they spoke of small victories and lessons learned. There was a sense of quiet completion, a realization that survival was no longer solely about enduring hardship, but about creating life, structure, and trust within the wilderness. The blanket's presence reinforced the intimacy of these moments, the shared understanding that they were forging a home together. Afternoon light cast long shadows across the cabin as she arranged provisions and tended to the remaining tasks of the day. She paused frequently to touch the blanket, appreciating its craftsmanship and the symbolic weight it carried. Each thread was a reminder of careful attention, deliberate effort, and the ability to provide comfort and safety in a world that had once felt unyielding and indifferent. The blanket represented continuity, a link between past struggles and the present moment of accomplishment. As evening approached, the wind rustled softly outside, carrying the scent of pine and earth. She wrapped herself in the woven blanket, feeling its weight and warmth seep into her shoulders. The Apache joined her, and together they sat in quiet reflection. The wilderness, once threatening and unwelcoming, now felt like a companion rather than a foe. Each artifact, culminating in the blanket, had taught her patience, skill, trust, and respect, qualities that now defined her relationship with both the land and the man who had become her partner. Night fell with serenity, and she placed the blanket carefully at the foot of her bedroll. Its fibers carried the memory of her journey, a tangible acknowledgement of the hardships overcome, the lessons absorbed, and the growth achieved. She understood that survival was inseparable from attentiveness, care, and reflection. The blanket, once simple fabric, had become a teacher of endurance, security, and love. Before sleep claimed her, she traced the woven patterns with her fingertips, reflecting on the cumulative lessons embedded in every artifact she had encountered. The wilderness was no longer merely a challenge to endure. It had become a classroom, a sanctuary, and a partner in shaping her resilience and understanding. The woven blanket was both culmination and promise, offering warmth, protection, and continuity for the life she would now lead alongside her child and the Apache who had guided her from abandonment to safety. In the quiet of the cabin, wrapped in the blanket's embrace, she realized that the journey had transformed her, not only in skill or survival, but in heart, patience, and trust. The artifacts, culminating in this final piece, had guided her toward clarity, stability, and a profound understanding of connection, both to the land and to another human being. As the fire crackled softly and shadows danced across the walls, she felt a deep sense of peace. The wilderness had been tamed not by domination, but by care, reflection, and deliberate action, a lesson she would carry always, as constant and enduring as the woven threads beneath her fingertips.